presented today, the economic as well as the feminist action for climate justice. So the action coalitions are a very unique process that brings together women's rights organizations, feminist and youth-led organizations, the private sector, philanthropic foundations, international organizations, member states, governments, and UN agencies together so that they can collectively drive transformative and game-changing change. So the Generation Equality Forum, it kicked off in Mexico. It's actually exactly about a year ago, around about March, and it was launched in June in France last year in 2021 at the Paris Forum. And also on that, the launch also, there was a global action, a global acceleration plan for gender equality, which was also presented at the launch of the Action Coalition. So the global acceleration plan is really brings together thousands of commitment makers for gender equality, and also they made commitments which will be implemented over the next 4 years. So this is the journey that we have so far as the Generation Equality Forum and as the Action Coalition. This has been the journey that we have. So today we are bringing together the Action Coalitions, and we are also trying to link, when you look at economic justice, climate justice, these are central to the theme of CSW 66, which is looking at climate change and disaster risk management. So there are a lot of synergies between these two action coalitions. When you look at everything that affects the economy, everything that affects the climate, there is really need for linking, but also breaking down these linkages and also ensuring that we are pushing a collective agenda. So this event will also address some of the structural issues on the nexus of the climate change and the care economy. We've really seen how COVID has been devastating and how care has really emerged as an issue, as a priority. So when we talk about building forward, when we talk about building differently, we're talking about a feminist green economy that centers women-led solutions to the climate crisis, that is also focusing on care work. And this includes care jobs, green jobs, interlinkages with the climate finance, and also investments around that. We'll also hear about the new collective commitments to be jointly developed by leaders of the action coalitions on economic justice and rights and feminist action for climate justice. This will identify the potential and the concrete actions towards an equitable and resilient economy that prioritizes the rights and needs of people and the planet in all their diversity. So as we are really moving on into today's discussion, and before I introduce our great esteemed speakers, I just wanted to speak a little bit about some of the structural links between economic, climate, and gender justice. When you talk about climate change, it's a major crisis in this generation. And at the heart of this are structural inequalities that are really embedded in the social, in the political, and the economic systems. So those who have less are located at the periphery of power, who also happen to contribute the least to the creation of the climate crisis, yet they carry the biggest burden of it. From Africa as a continent, we contribute less than 4% of the world's green gas emissions. However, when you look at the social economic status, as well as the historical and geographical positioning, it makes the continent more vulnerable to some of the climate emergence with inadequate capacity to adapt and to progress. So the overlapping crises of climate change, of COVID, pandemic, even the crisis, the hidden crisis of gender-based violence and also the issues around care. When you look at it, they've really exposed and intensified some of the patterns of inequality and marginalization, and also the systemic and structural barriers. So this really calls for a feminist and intersectional approach in responding and prioritizing all our policy and practical actions. And I think at CSW 66, we are providing solutions as well. I would now like to transition and also introduce the panel on the solutions that are needed to address the issues that lie at the intersection of climate change and the care economy. So at this point, I would like to welcome the government leaders for the Economic Justice and Rights Action Coalition. We'll hear from Her Excellency Maria Luisa Albores Gonzalez, the Minister of Environment from the Government of Mexico. Then we'll also hear from Ms. Annika Leisten, a Senior Advisor for the Swedish International Development Agency. We will have a video. From Her Excellency. If I may ask our media team, and as our media team is coming, the question for Her Excellency is, how can governments support building a feminist green economy, and within that address the interlinkages of climate crisis and the care economy? Your Excellency, you can go ahead.
Hola, buenos días. Mi nombre es María Luisa Albores González, Secretaria de Medio Ambiente y Recursos Naturales del Gobierno de México. Es un gusto poder compartir este mensaje en un marco tan importante como es el diálogo hacia una economía justa en materia de género y clima, financiación del nexo climático y cuidado. En México trabajamos para construir nuevas y mejores realidades para las mujeres, no solo desde lo económico, sino también en el ámbito social, cultural, político y ambiental. Trabajamos para que las mujeres juntas sigamos sumando esfuerzos y coayudando para que nuestras voces no solo tengan escucha, sino sean también guía para la vida buena, como históricamente hemos trazado, pero sobre todo para que construyamos una verdadera igualdad sustantiva en la que los derechos de las niñas y mujeres sean efectivos, en la que ninguna se quede atrás. Por ello, en México nos hemos dado a la tarea de dar a conocer y sobre todo reconocer el arduo trabajo y compromiso de las mujeres cuidadoras, quienes dedican gran parte de su vida para conservar, restaurar y aprovechar de manera sustentable su biodiversidad y los recursos naturales que albergan sus territorios, con el propósito de contribuir al disfrute de un medio ambiente sano y proteger su tierra, fuente de trabajo y alimentación de sus familias. Esto lo hemos traducido en la generación de bienestar y felicidad para ellas a través de la reducción de brechas de respecto a la propiedad de tierra y la toma de decisiones ambientales, así como aquellas dirigidas a la redistribución equitativa del tiempo y el trabajo de cuidado entre mujeres y hombres para un desarrollo basado en la igualdad y la sustentabilidad. Ese es el trabajo que venimos haciendo. Es un gusto para mí poder compartir unas palabras con ustedes. Muchísimas gracias.
Secretaría de Medio Ambiente y Recursos Naturales.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for really framing for us the linkages, as well as just sharing those powerful statements. I will move on and introduce Ms. Kekashan Basu. Might not have said it well, but I'll introduce who is also the founder and president for Green Hope Foundation and youth leader for the Action Coalition on Feminist Action for Climate Justice. Oh, sorry, my apologies. Sorry, before I bring you in, may I ask Madam Annika Leisen, the Senior Advisor for the Swedish International Development. Sorry for that, I've gone way ahead. Go ahead and welcome.
Thank you so much, Memory. And I must say that as Sweden, we are so happy to be part of this important event. And thank you for your question about what governments can do. And I think the first response is that we have to acknowledge that the climate crisis is a gender crisis. and that the gender crisis in the form of a backlash contribute in itself to the climate crisis. And as you rightly said, climate change has a severe impact on women who account for the majority of unpaid work, not only household work like cooking and raising children, but also responsibilities like energy and water and cultivation of land. And when climate change leads to acute shortage of water and energy, that challenges really affect women unproportionately. Women have to work harder, travel further, and assume more responsibility. And the result is time poverty with less opportunity for women. And still, the care dimension is largely absent from climate change programming, even though the climate crisis exacerbates existing inequalities between men and women. And this needs to be changed. At the same time as we see deteriorating conditions for women due to climate change, we also see the backlash of gender and feminist movements. Feminists are seen as a threat, and strong forces want to push back the movement. So the question is this a coincidence? No, I don't think so. I think it reflects that women are powerful actors of change who challenge existing strategies. This in turn reflects that we have to combine our work for gender justice, environmental justice, and feministic work. And therefore the feminist movement have such an important role to play. At the same time as women are severely affected, women can join forces and continue to make significant contributions to sustainable development. In this regard, I also want to say that it is important to include men who want to see changes. However, if we want to achieve a feminist green economy, we have to address so much more than technical solutions. We must address the foundations of our societies that have led us into this environmental crisis. And we have to address it in a holistic and feminist way. We see increasingly that women in community take action in concrete terms, like in development, eco-friendly agriculture, and building resilient structures, and do so in a feminist manner. Furthermore, women are at the forefront when it comes to preserving land or hindering pollution and land degradation for extractive industries. These women on local ground, they need support, and we as funders and as government who support feminist movements must be taking the responsibility to support on a global level, but also on a national and global level, because we must see each other as interlinked. While having such a critical role for transformative and lasting change, women's rights organizations receive only a fraction of all gender-focused aid, and this needs to be changed. Furthermore, if we as government want to contribute to transformational change, we have to address economic injustices. Within this context, the care economy is pivotal. By investing in programs like health, education, and social protection, we can contribute to a just care economy. Adequate universal social protection is an essential component for a transition to a sustainable zero-carbon economy. This requires an economy-wide process that produces plans, policies, and investment that lead to a sustainable future with full employment, decent work, and social protection for women and men alike. Lastly, I would like to bring up the importance for governments to have a feminist foreign policy. Having such a policy, government can put gender equality on the agenda and concretely support actors of change. Therefore, we are very happy that Sweden, within the policy of the feminist foreign policy, has a specific funding window for gender equality that focuses on support to feminist actors. We are proud partners to a number of organizations that build strong women's movement that address challenges both on a local level as well as on a global level. Sweden is committed to the Generation Equality Forum, and we are co-leader of the Global Action Coalition on Economic Justice and Rights. As part of the feministic foreign policy, Sweden works to promote the mainstreaming of the gender and rights perspective in processes for a sustainable development, and we push for gender equality in multilateral climate and environmental funds and in the implementation of the Paris Agreement. In conclusion, as an answer to the question what governments can do, I would like to encourage others to implement a feminist foreign policy, since that in practice means that you're also having an environmental foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Layson. Thank you so much, Her Excellency Gonzalez, for sharing what governments can do and also for acknowledging that the climate crisis is a gender crisis and the backlash on feminist movements should be challenged. It is not a coincidence. We must allow women on the front line to lead in sharing stories and to lead in local solutions. Thank you so much. And we also urge other governments to have a feminist foreign policy to address the environmental crisis, the gender crisis, as well as the climate crisis as well. So now I want to transition and I'll ask Ms. Kekashan Basu, I hope I got it right, the founder and president of Green Hope Foundation, a youth leader for the Action Coalition on Feminist Action for Climate Justice, a very amazing influencer as well as activist on climate justice. My question to you, as a young feminist leader working in the environmental space, what are some of the specific considerations that must be taken into account to ensure that we are addressing the climate change and care in an intersectional way?
Thank you, Memory, for the introduction, and thank you for the question. And hello, everyone. I speak here today as a representative of a unique minority, as a feminist leader in environmental advocacy, and also as a young person. And despite our leadership roles in this arena being recognized repeatedly in our society today, we're still seeing this as a doubly disadvantageous situation. And that literally compounds the challenges and the lack of inclusivity which young women, particularly young women of color like me, face as we strive to mitigate the various intersecting challenges confronting women and girls in all of our diversity, which have now been further exemplified by the pandemic. Through my organization, Green Hope Foundation, we work both at a grassroots level and also engage in the policymaking process, providing fact-based inputs and endeavoring to bridge that elusive gap between theory and practice that can truly help to bring about meaningful and substantive change in the lives of those who need it the most. And our work is amongst some of the world's most marginalized communities where traditions and conventions place often insurmountable burdens on women and girls. And these are essentially the cis heteropatriarchal societies where education and modern thought processes haven't touched, where women's access to land is hindered by customary, traditional, religious practices, making it difficult to invest in climate resilient livelihood activities. Gender inequality in terms of land and other productive resources is linked to women's poverty and exclusion all over the world. And we have encountered this in all the 26 countries that we work in. So challenging these discriminatory ideas is critical as part of feminist justice. For the last many years, we've been working in forest-dependent communities of the Sundarbans, the world's largest mangrove forest, that has witnessed significant land loss due to climate change. These have caused an outward migration of the men first, leaving women with an additional burden of sole responsibility and care of their families. Climate change, as we all know, is an inequality multiplier, especially impacting these women who are already disadvantaged economically and socially. And in the aftermath, of climate disasters such as those wrought by Cyclone Isla and Amphan and Yas, it is the women on whom the burden of unpaid care falls, and they're expected to carry on their other roles without a pause. And moreover, since these women are underrepresented in local governance structures, including those for land management, forestry, and fisheries, and since their contributions are undervalued, they are not viewed as stakeholders in adaptation decision-making. Adult illiteracy is extremely high in these conservative communities, more so amongst the women who are unaware of their rights. So our programs have been addressing these challenges, imparting vocational and skills-based education, enabling the women to become economically independent that has now made them socially resilient. Many of these women are now part of the village councils, having a say for the first time ever. But what we've seen is that these success stories are few and far between and largely driven by non-state actors like Green Hope Foundation. And that is why we urgently require state policies that support the upscaling of these initiatives with financial investments to back them, leading to substantive increase in women's influence in decision-making with regard to climate justice, land management. And a significant learning from our work across 26 countries is the fact that we cannot apply one generalized solution or adaptation mechanism, even though the problem might be the same, be it of climate change or biodiversity loss. We must not make the mistake of painting the entire women and girls constituency with one brush, because our challenges and the impacts are unique across age groups and the communities that we belong to, and other social determinants. And within them, young women and girls, as well as older women, face different kinds and degrees of challenges. And similarly, the geographies need to be evaluated independently, because what we do in Bangladesh or India doesn't work in Liberia or in the DRC. So finally, this requires a deep understanding of the local paradigms. And that is why solutions need to be bottom up and be implemented from within in order to be successful. And therein lies the importance of data. At the root of the current ineffectiveness that stymies current policymaking is an abyssal lack of disaggregated data that prevents informed decision-making. And remedying this would require substantive investments as well as accountability and transparency in the dissemination of this data so that policies can support actions. And to drive all these, we need decision makers to be representative of the diversity within the Women's Caucus, so that each one of us has their own voices amplified the entire spectrum of our diversity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Basu, for really highlighting the importance of women's economic justice from a community women-led perspective, the intersections, why young women should also be at the center of making the decisions, and also that they are not homogeneous. Solutions need to be contextualized as well. Local solutions are important, but also state policies that are backed by investment. Thank you so much. I want to move on and introduce Ms. Kaiser Hayter-Reis, the Vice President of External Relations for the Global Green Grants Fund and the leader for the Action Coalition on Feminist Action for Climate Justice. Ms. Hayter-Reis from Global Green Grants, your fund focuses on investing in Indigenous people and local communities. So how can the Indigenous people and local communities and women developed and led solutions to economic climate crisis, can they ensure adequate financing for them? If I can rephrase it, I think it's just to say, how can we prioritize that Indigenous people and local communities and women-led and driven solutions are actually financed adequately?
Thank you, Memory, and thank you to all of the leaders of the EJR and FACJ Action coalitions, as well as the organizers of this important CSW UN Women event. We at Global Green Grants Fund are so honored to be a part of the Feminist Action and Climate Justice Coalition and to be here. And before answering your question directly, Memory, I wanted to dig in a bit more into the issues behind our current economy because they affect everything that we're talking about. And most of us know, are well aware of it, but they are worth repeating. In his recent book, Our Stolen Focus, Johan Hari reminds us of the main catastrophic force that is undermining the future of our people and planet. And that is since the 1880s, most economies have been built around economic growth. And we've absorbed the idea that every year our economy and each individual company in it should get bigger and bigger and make more and more profits. This is how we define success. So if a country's economy grows, its politicians will be reelected, its CEOs will be rewarded. Economic growth is at the center, is a central organizing principle in our society. It is at the heart of how we operate in the world. Yet this insatiable existence, as we know, will end up killing every living thing on our planet, including those politicians and billionaire CEOs. This insatiable existence also defines who has value. So if you don't fuel the economic growth of corporations and countries and have data or the numbers to show you do, then you are not seen or heard. This insatiable existence means that indigenous and local peoples who are protecting the culture and 80% of the Earth's remaining biodiversity don't have value. People with disabilities, women who are nurturing their communities and the vitality of the planet, yet who are either not paid for it or are not part of the economy driven by care and not by profits, they don't have value. All of those who are sustaining life and justice and those young people who are our future don't have value in this current economic model. Yet if we and the planet are to survive, then we must upend this model and redefine success. A report commissioned by federal regulators overseeing the US commodities markets concluded that a world fracked by frequent and devastating shocks from climate change cannot sustain the fundamental conditions supporting our financial system. And indigenous and local women developed and led solutions to the economic and climate crisis are essential to the existential shift we need in order to survive. And so let's dig into why a little bit more. UNFCCC Executive Secretary Patricia Espinosa said that when Indigenous women engage, climate policies and actions on every level benefit from their holistic, nature-focused knowledge and leadership. On unwomen.org, it's noted that an increasing women's representation in national parliaments leads to climate change policies that result in lower emissions. And at local level, women in natural resource management are associated with better resource governance and conservation outcomes. Foreign Affairs wrote that women's equality is being rolled back while authoritarianism is on the rise. So women's civil rights and democracy go hand in hand. And when women participate in mass movements, those movements are both more likely to succeed and more likely to lead to more egalitarian democracy. So fully free, politically active women are a threat to authoritarian and authoritarian leaning leaders. So those leaders have a strategic reason to be sexist. And women around the globe are at the forefront of addressing the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation, as has already been said this morning. And they're designing, implementing, and scaling the most lasting solutions against immense odds. So how do we prioritize them, as you asked? We act, not talk. We show that the only viable solutions to these crises come from reconstructing an economy where decisions are driven by life and justice and not by profits. We ensure that indigenous and local women and their communities have a center seat in all global decision-making spaces and economic and political powerhouses. We ensure that climate and justice-related projects we fund have IPLC women leadership at the core, including in the move to renewable energies. We show that we recognize that our planet is still here in spite of the determination to destroy it, largely because of the care Indigenous women and women in local communities give. We end false solutions that are shaped around corporate greenwashing and fortress conservation, and which cause further harm to Indigenous and local communities, and particularly the women and girls in them. We ensure that Indigenous and local communities and women have land rights. As funders, we create program strategies which are jointly developed by those managing environmental justice, climate change, human rights, and gender equality portfolios. A healthy environment cannot be achieved without women's leadership, and women's rights cannot be fully respected without a healthy environment. Adapting funding strategies and recognition of this interconnectedness is essential. We assure that gender equality and the rights of Indigenous and local women in their communities are key to measuring outcomes. And finally, and critically, how do we ensure adequate funding gets to them, as you asked? Then the need and priorities of local communities should come from and drive our funding, and our speakers earlier addressed this. Our funding to them needs to be accessible, it needs to be multi-year, unrestricted, and get directly to those doing the work. We need to show trust that they have the answers and follow that with a shift of decision-making power. The small scale of many women's communities and Indigenous organizations can prevent access to large-scale funders, but large funders often give large funding packages with stringent timelines and reporting requirements and don't have the time or resources to engage with every community they seek to support. So here we can fund through intermediaries who have spent decades developing trusting relationships with local and Indigenous communities and who understand and respect local contexts, as Kekeshan was talking about the importance of that, and can distribute large funds in a healthy and holistic way. For example, we at Global Green Grants and Gaga are mobilizing $100 million in resources as our commitment to the feminist action and climate justice to women and girl-led organizations directly working at the intersection of feminist action and climate justice. Another important thing we can do is reach out to the phenomenal CSOs, women groups, and youth groups like Kekeshan was mentioning, who are part of the Generation Equality Action Coalition celebrated today and who have direct access and knowledge of the layers of challenges that Indigenous and local women and girls face, and we fund through them. And we don't have time, so we need to do this now today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Hater-Rice. You know, you've said so much, and you've actually given us the how in terms of what we should do. We should act and not talk, committing and really prioritizing leadership of Indigenous women and local communities, and that we must be intentional and consistent in really positioning women as leaders. And also the funding, you know, that is flexible, that is multi-year, but that trust that women actually know how, and, you know, the kind of funding architecture and ecosystem should shift. So thank you so much for those very powerful solutions and what you are doing together with the communities. I'll just move on now to introduce Ms. Teresa Makwara, who's representing Zimbabwe Parents for Handicapped Children Association. So Ms. Makwara, if given your experience working on the ground in Zimbabwe, what are some of the solutions for care and climate that are most needed for grassroots women? And I understand you have a presentation.
Thank you, Memory. As you have mentioned already, my name is Teresa Makwara on behalf of Zimbabwe Parents of Handicapped Children Association. We work with grassroots women leaders leading more than 1,500 caregivers in Zimbabwe. Second slide. ZPC is currently working with more than 1,500 in secondary caregivers across Zimbabwe. And we are currently working in rural, urban, peri-urban communities, providing secondary caregiving and primary caregiving and children with disabilities. And as our caregivers are at the forefront of implementing disaster risk reduction and climate change resilient programs. And ZPHA is a member of WIRE Commission. Second slide. And why we caregivers are organizing themselves for climate action, about 95% of our caregivers are women living in poverty that depend on rain-fed seasonal farming and perform unpaid care work. Hence, they are vulnerable to climate change. And due to climate change, our caregivers are facing increasing food insecurity. Disasters in Zimbabwe are increasing unpaid care workload, thus giving the caregivers on entrepreneurship and economic opportunities. This is contributing to the sexual exploitation of women and girls, and caregivers themselves are vulnerable to sexual exploitation and forced marriages in exchange of basic food items. However, we are not vulnerable. We caregivers are agents of change, and members and stakeholders lack information on disaster risk reduction and always look up to solutions. Yes, we act. How we caregivers are in the front. We use some of these tools and strategies that include mapping. As caregivers, we obtain information on numbers of women and communities affected in climate change, and we identify local resources, prioritized needs and stakeholders. And on the entrepreneur levels and value addition skills, as caregivers, we are learning new method skills through implementing resilience building livelihoods projects such as gardening, fruit forestry, poultry, and fisheries. And as stakeholders engagement, caregivers, we host formal dialogue meetings with local and stakeholders, government, traditional leaders, and other stakeholders dialoguing on women land rights and equal participation in decision-making and justice delivery. The caregivers, we have also successfully advocated for equal land, water, natural resources, and also to our government to support us with input for allocation for women-led livelihoods project.
Yes.
Though our collective action, we have increased our visibility. We have, as grassroots women, we have been heard and being heard at every level of decision-making, policy-making, and budgeting. And we are claiming leadership positions at community level and authority, traditional leaders, and other community institutions. Yes, as caregivers, we are now achieving food, income security, and livelihoods project. For example, some of these are our success stories. Second slide. What we need as caregivers, we want access and ownership of assets and productive resources, such as land, water, and housing, and financial services to our communities, like business loans and caregivers grants, of which if we access economic opportunities, including through value chains, paid jobs, and also on the social protection that appropriately value and compensate caregivers. And also on the climate change information, we want early warning systems like disaster management and rehabilitation. The flexible finance for local caregivers and other grassroots organizations, including climate financing institutions, and support for integrated approaches that recognize the impacts of climate change and caregivers, and the role of caregivers in building community resilience, social protection. As we are caregivers, we are leading climate action in our communities. Now, we are demanding at every level of decision-making, budget-making, policy-making, programs, implementation in climate change, and COVID response. Nothing for us without us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mrs. Makwara, for really sharing, the experiences and also the solutions that has been happening at the grassroots level. Thank you also for making those demands in terms of what is really needed for a transition, and also that centers issues around care and the intersection with climate justice. I'll move on to introduce Ms. Nolene Nabulivu, the Executive Director of Diverse Voices and Action for Equality, which is also known as DIVA. She's a civil society leader for the Action Coalition on Feminist Action for Climate Justice. And DIVA as an organization is working in Fiji in a region that is incredibly susceptible to climate change impacts. Can you kindly provide us with some of the specific examples of solutions for addressing issues at the intersection of climate and care?
Thanks very much, Chair, and all of our wonderful speakers who are here. I'm already enjoying it so much. Our main proposal at DIVA for Equality has always been that socioeconomic, ecological, and climate justice are always inherently linked, and that the feminist tactics and strategies are required for any real both material and system change to happen. So I really speak from the work and my life in Fiji and the Pacific. Context really matters. So in terms of local realities and socioeconomic, ecological, and climate dimensions in the Pacific, we really have to address front and center on any work that we have to look at coloniality, at heteropatriarchy, at neoliberal fossil-fueled capitalism, because those are the things that have the greatest impact on both our smallest ecosystems, on all species, on us as humans, and on the largest ecosphere. And so our responses have to be at the very, very granular and at the meta level, at the whole planetary level. And the sexual and gender-based violence that we have in our region, we have some of the highest rates in the world per capita. There's still very few members of women in national legislative bodies. And unfortunately, in a couple of our countries here in the Pacific, there's no women at all in the parliament. We have some of the remaining colonies in the world, including a 60+ year genocide in West Papua by Indonesia, climate change, loss and damage, and responses beyond adaptation, where we're living right now. The COVID pandemic resulted in such high levels of unemployment. Our debt skyrocketed over just 1 year. And we have the intersectionality issues of what happens in different locations through the country, from the urban informal settlements through to rural and maritime areas. We have over 300 islands. So, and that's just us. And then we have 22 island states and territories in the region. And then all of those different intersectional identity issues of gender and ethnicity, socioeconomic class, indigenous hierarchical status as well, disability, and then these issues of unpaid and paid care, domestic, and we talk a lot about communal work in the Pacific as well, because they sit heavily on the bodies of women. And in the midst of these sets of crises, there is all the different sets of work that are happening across mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, climate finance, and all of these issues we have to deal with, both as states, but also crop agencies, development agencies, civil society. So what does interlinkage and intersectional climate and care work look like in Fiji? There's so much. There's both the materials and system change happening. We do know that it has to be about better research and analysis. We have now, for instance, an example is the rapid care analysis in 3 rural communities in Fiji, and a synthesis of those 3 studies that really reveal a lot of lessons, but also those huge gaps and obstacles that we require in order to change policy, in order to reconfigure the state, so that we really can take care of those care economy issues. So because of all these structural inequalities that are faced by women, girls, gender non-binary people, and yes, many men in rural areas, they're hugely impacted by both the climate crisis and environmental destruction. But we also have to think about things like 2 to 3 times the unpaid care, domestic and communal work being done by women and girls. We estimate also that in the pandemic period, and then during these constant climate change disasters, that in itself doubles, and sometimes more. And we don't take account of that, both in our everyday societal practices, but also in terms of the practices of the state. And I would argue in terms of multilateral systems as well. We're not talking about the gendered effects on the entire system if we don't take into account unpaid care, domestic and paid care work as well. The climate and DRR adds to overall work burden. And when we overlay things like non-cash and cash economies, pandemic effects, stretched basic services in, say, a small island state, and it's different around the world, the housing, the health, the water, the reach of the state in rural and maritime areas, there are huge limits. And those become more starkly visible when you put together climate, economic and ecological justice. And I just wanted to say, maybe, what does that work look like to confront this? Well, it's about tackling both the root causes of heteropatriarchy, extractivist economies. Yes, it is. It's about work to reconfigure ourselves and society and state, our relationships, issues of justice and care and social provisioning. What does a social floor and social protection and social infrastructure set of work look like when you're in the middle of these crises of loss and damage? We need better data research and analysis, and there is work on that, on multidimensional poverty measurement. There's work on human rights studies of LGBTQI issues, for instance. We have some work by women in poverty networks who are generating their own data and then strategies on pro-poor policy. And there are things, everything from building houses, building bridges, building seawalls, and all of these things that have to happen both at the granular and the systemic shift. So maybe I'll end that now and to say, the last thing I'd say is we had to put together in a very short period of time 26,000 meals over a 6-month period for school children who couldn't go back to school because there wasn't enough money in the household economies. That is about care, but it is also about ecological issues and climate change. So thank you. I'll end on that note. Thank you.
Thank you, Nolene, for sharing the experiences and the realities in Fiji, but also some of the structural and systemic things that need to change. And, you know, when feminists are calling for system change, I think it's important for us to amplify the voices, to really shift and start reflecting on some of the contextual issues like colonialism, heteronormativity, neoliberalism, and also heteropatriarchy, and also really move towards a transformative change. Thank you so much, Nolene. I'll move on to Ms. Lisa Williams, the team lead for gender equality and women's empowerment for the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate. OECD is a leader for the Economic Justice and Rights Action Coalition. And before I ask her the question, I just want to remind everyone, please share your comments, your questions, put them in the chat, put them in the question and answer section. Ms. Williams will be the last to speak on this panel before we move to the next segment. So, Ms. Williams, we've heard from the different angles during today's panel. We've had so many angles on care. We've also had on solutions, on investment. From OECD's perspective, as an intergovernmental organization, what is needed to adequately address the issues at the center of the intersections between care and climate, also including how climate financing can be leveraged for gender equality?
Thank you, Memory, for having me here today for this special event. And I would just like to say, first of all, that the other speakers have been excellent, and I think given us many ideas about questions around multi-year financing, systems change, things that we can do to make changes. From the perspective of the OECD, I can't speak for the entire OECD, I would say, but I think what we're trying to do the most is really look closely at this nexus between climate action and gender equality, and to think about how we can reflect back some of the issues around financing and seek improvements in that area in particular. But let me just start by thanking you, of course, UN Women, and also the Generation Equality Forum Action Coalition leaders who are here with us today as well. We're proud to be part of this initiative too. And the team that I'm leading working on gender equality and women's empowerment has worked closely on all of the questions around the development of the work on the Generation Equality Forum, and then also really, leading us in the right direction toward the Agenda 2030 and achieving SDG 5. This moment, I think, for us all together is an important one. Yesterday, we had an event that we held on climate action and gender equality and how to bring this nexus together, and really with the full recognition of the fact that women and girls are most affected by this crisis, and non-binary populations as well, and that this is an extremely important moment for us to try to drive change. Today, what I'll do is just try to speak about a couple of aspects that I think we can help to address. So I'll just go one in looking at driving up the quantity and quality of development finance for gender equality and climate action, and looking at the nexus of what kinds of activities we know actually already exist. And then thinking about how we can enhance the impact of development finance through more policy dialogue, greater peer learning, and more coordination among the different actors. And I see this moment, actually, this event, as a great one for quite a bit of dialogue and peer learning. But just first on some of the numbers, so be patient with me on the numbers. It's important to have our data points. So driving up the quantity of development finance and gender equality, and really integrating gender equality into climate action, we can see that official development assistance overall, first of all, is committed to, by the Development Assistance Committee members, is committed at a level of about $161 billion per year. This is the data from 2020. So this is not only actually on gender equality, but overall official development assistance, just to give us an order of grandeur. And we do see, in analyzing the nexus of gender and climate, that there is an increase in funding in this area, which means that there are more programs happening in this area on the part of the aid donors particularly. So our data indicates the total volume of ODA to climate action stands today at $33 billion per year, which is higher than ever before. This amount of climate ODA that integrates gender equality as a part of the objectives is also consistently on the rise, and corresponds to about 57% of climate ODA. So our forthcoming analysis indicates, and we'll have this out for you quite soon, that in regions where the climate nexus is particularly acute or really an issue, such as looking at the Sahel and West Africa, DAC members are committing higher shares of their climate ODA to gender equality concerns. So there's some recognition here, obviously, of what must be happening in the region, particularly in the West Africa region in this case. However, climate ODA dedicated to gender equality challenges remains less than 0.5% of all climate-related ODA. So let me just take you through what we mean by integrated and dedicated. So it's important to understand that when we're looking at different sectors, it seems that we are able to look at health, sanitation, other areas that are under the climate and gender nexus and see that there is a rise. However, when it comes to really dedicating things to working on gender equality issues, which might include sexual exploitation, violence, other issue areas, that type of support is relatively limited and is remaining quite limited. And we would like to see a rise there. Even in addition, even as women play a critical role in climate change response, women's organizations remain extremely underfunded, as we've heard speaker after speaker in this panel. And memory, this is something that we really do have to grapple with on a broader scale, and also for the climate ODA and gender nexus too. Today, from our analysis, climate ODA integrating gender equality objectives comes to little more than $43 million US. More climate financing needs to go to multi-year funding and core funding for women's rights organizations. And I would say that we need to work together with this panel and with you going forward on this. It's also important now for us to examine where the development finance is being allocated in order to be able to understand how we can better address unpaid care work and the climate crisis. We are here talking about climate and care, so let me come to the care point. We developed some work, a piece called Enabling Women's Economic Empowerment, New Approaches to Unpaid Care Work in Developing Countries before the COVID crisis. we do need to go and I think look much more closely at the changes that have happened. But what we talked about and what I think remains very important is how can we look at the redistribution, the shared responsibility within households, how we can promote changes in terms of social protection, so social infrastructure and public services to better address the needs of women in terms of care work. Our climate financing analysis shows us that the social infrastructure and services sectors receive the lowest shares of climate ODA integrating gender equality objectives. So this was quite a lot of data for one section, but essentially additional finance has to be there to complement ODA, and the full toolbox of development finance needs to be there to support gender equality and climate change. It will be increasingly important for us to mobilize the private sector and to use blended finance mechanisms as well to scale up development and climate finance in support of gender equality. So it will not only be ODA that will bring us there, it really is a concerted effort with the private sector as well. The OECD's document some examples.
Sorry to interject. I am speaking too fast. If you can just slow a little bit. I know we are running out of time, but I just slow a little bit.
Absolutely. I apologize. Yes. So what we need to be thinking about in this second part is a little bit about the impact of development finance through policy dialogue, peer learning, and coordination. So while increasing the amount of development finance is key towards achieving our objectives on climate action and gender equality, we also need to enhance its impact on the ground and better connect gender and climate change communities. So we need to build a bridge so that these communities are speaking to each other more and more in the future. In the OECD, the Development Assistance Committee runs a network on gender equality and another network on environment issues. And we bring these platforms together in order to conduct more peer learning and have more joined up approaches. These are places where we can look at the financing questions as well. The OECD here, we are also developing guidance on gender equality and women's empowerment in development cooperation, designed to help development partners to be more fit for purpose for the work that we're doing. And we have developed as well the DAC Declaration on Climate Change, where donors have committed to aligning ODA with the goals of the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. And in this declaration, the members recognize the urgent need to support investments in climate action that are gender responsive. Finally, it'll be necessary to hold development partners accountable for commitments that they make at the Generation Equality Forum. And with this in mind, the OECD has developed analysis that a colleague of mine will put into the chat on the financing across the action coalitions, and also in the Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Affairs Assistance Compact, which allows us to monitor over time how the financing is evolving. So with that, I think the most important point here is that we do need to work together to address some of these systemic issues and to ensure that we have the increased financing and other ways to engage together as partners. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for really sharing the commitment that OECD has on the financial resources for the nexus between gender and climate change, but also stressing the multi-year unrestricted flexible funding. I think this is something we really need to keep mentioning as well. And one thing which came out from the Africa CSW that we have been having here in Nairobi on climate financing is that we don't want climate financing to be loans to reinforce some of the debt and some of those structural issues. So I just want to thank the panel really for really sharing the solutions on the nexus between climate justice, between economic justice, as well as K economy. And there is a question from Merani Nawandra on young women of color are here too. Would you be able to present us with information from the work that you have conducted from community level? So this is a direct question to Keashan. I'll just allow you to respond to it before we move to the next session.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. Yes, You will be able to see more about the work that we do on our website, greenhopefoundation.com. And since we work in 26 countries with women and girls in all of our diversity, it addresses the various and myriad issues that women and girls around the world face, whether that is addressing lack of clean water and sanitation due to climate change-induced disasters or lack of education, or even recognizing the work that women are doing every day to become leaders in sustainability to bring about change in their own zones of influence. And I've shared the link. I'll share the link in the chat as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We won't have enough time for question and answer, but just to thank you to all our panelists for this session, for the very insightful and very powerful insights. We need to have that system change, and also for those that connected and also contributed to this conversation. So we want to just transition for announcing the plans for a collective commitment between the Action Coalitions on Economic Justice and Rights and Feminist Action for Climate Justice. So I want to introduce Ms. Emanuela Pozan, a senior specialist for gender equality and the International Labour Law Organization, and Ms. Katie Tobin, a senior program manager for the Women's Environment and Developmental Organization, WIDO, for the joint intervention on the commitment between these two action coalitions. So both to you, Katie and Emanuela. Usually when we have these events, CSW, Generation Equality, these are a space for stakeholders to come together, share their ideas and work. However, collaboration between the Action Coalitions on Economic Justice and Rights and the Feminist Action for Climate Justice is resulting in something more concrete. You know, we're always asking, what is the concrete action? So can you share more about your plans for this collective action?
Thank you. Thank you, Memory. I'm happy to share with Katie this commitment. And so today our two coalitions are introducing a new collective commitment as part of Generation Equality. And the commitment is to advance work on climate and care, to ensure that today's event is not just a series of speeches, but a meaningful step forward on progress on these important issues, contributing to the systemic and structural change required to ensure feminist climate and economic justice.
We're developing a roadmap to outline this collective commitment to promote the increase of global climate finance directed towards and invested in intersectional, gender-just climate solutions. And these solutions must focus on care as a human right and as a public good, as part of a just and equitable transition to a care-led, sustainable recovery, grounded in care for both each other and for our planet.
And so the roadmap will identify concrete and time-bound steps towards, among others, 1, formally recognizing, reducing, and redistributing unpaid care and domestic work, including by dismantling and transforming discriminatory social norms and barriers in the care economy, the gender division of labor, women's leadership and participation, and women's access to and control over productive resources such as land. And 2, strengthening legal and policy frameworks that create and promote care jobs as green jobs and reward and represent care workers as part of the just and equitable transition to an inclusive, feminist, and regenerative sustainable economy.
In addition, a couple more things that the roadmap will outline is how we can advance new and additional financing to support climate action and the provision of public care services and infrastructure, and ensure that this climate finance is accessible to Indigenous, grassroots, and rural organizations working on women's rights and climate justice. And we've heard already today how important that is. And as Nolene mentioned, we also need to step up our work on data. So the roadmap will include a commitment on increasing the collection, systematization, and use of disaggregated data on the intersections of care and climate as a contribution to evidence-based and transformative policy, financing, advocacy, and programming. And this has important links to another commitment under the Feminist Coalition for Climate Justice, which is the new Gender and Environment Data Alliance, which is working on exactly this.
And so the roadmap will also be crucial to articulate how climate financing can enable the creation of decent care jobs that contribute to a regenerative green economy in accordance with the set Economic Justice and Rights Coalition 2026 targets for the care economy. And the timeline for the commitment will be 2026, in line with the targets of the Global Acceleration Plan associated with both our action coalitions, and the roadmap will be produced by 2023.
So as we get this work off the ground, we look forward to your support and participation in this collective work to make this commitment a reality, guided by the principles of human rights, decent work, intersectionality, gender equality, and climate justice. Thank you. Memory to you.
Thank you so much, Katie. Thank you so much, Emanuela, for putting together this joint commitment and really sharing the roadmap. We look forward to seeing this roadmap and also aligning it with processes like the Global Accelerated Plan for 2026. Thank you so much. So dear participants, everyone who has been connecting today, I think the interventions today have really shown us why it's critical to have solutions for gender equality and the power and the empowerment of women at the center of the intersection between the care economy and the climate emergency. I really want to thank our great panel, and all your contributions also in the chat box. And that's it's really just to thank how you have also collectively, I think we need to individually in our own spheres of influence, see how we can collectively advance these solutions and also learn from each other. And that if we really need to achieve the SDGs and gender equality, we need more solutions oriented. The report from Equal Measures 2030 actually shows that we will not achieve gender equality unless we have radical actions that we can work together collectively. So the collective commitment that has been announced today will be one example through which your engagement can effect change. And I also invite you to look at the global acceleration plans for economic justice and rights, and also for the Feminist Action for Climate Justice, to see how your work can best contribute to the generation equality. So if you're interested in what you've heard today, would like you to become involved in the action coalitions. It's not too late to join. The slide shows the details on how you can become a commitment maker as an organization, as a funding partner. Also urge your countries as well as member states, private sector, all the multi-stakeholders to become commitment makers. So you're all welcome to join this process as well. And in doing so, join the Global Action Coalition community. So the commitments should be measurable, they should be game-changing, they should be implemented within 5-year timeline of the process, and this can take a form of a financial, a policy, a programmatic, or advocacy commitment. There are also opportunities to join the collective commitment, so you can have a joint commitment like you heard today, and also bring together the the intersectionality of all stakeholders for maximum impact. A commitment dashboard is also being launched this week, where you'll be able to access all the commitments made to the action coalitions. And today is the 24-hour Action Coalition Day, so we hope you'll be able to join the other segments here at CSW 66. So thank you so much. Thank you to UN Women. Thank you to the Action Coalition leaders and commitment makers for the economic justice and rights and the feminist action for climate change. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon, great morning, and a great evening. Thank you.